Okay. I am joined once again on Bad Faith Podcast by an all-star A-team of student debt experts and advocates. We have Deputy Executive Director and Managing Counsel at Student Borrower Protection Center, Persis Yu, returning to the podcast. Welcome back, Persis.
Hello.
And strategist with the Debt Collective and founder of Jubilee Legal, Sparky Abraham. Welcome back, Sparky.
Hello. Thank you for having me back.
All right. As everyone now knows, the Supreme Court weighed in, gave its final judgment on whether or not Joe Biden's student debt cancellation plan was constitutional. Quick recap, his plan was to cancel up to $20,000 of debt. For most people, just $10,000 of debt for people earning under less than $125,000 in the years, I think, 2020 and 2021. Is that right? And the $20,000 is for Pell Grant recipients, so the most needy of student debtors. And the court said no. Now, this is perhaps unsurprising given the many episodes that we've done on this podcast over the last couple of years, anticipating what the legal arguments were going to be against Biden's student debt plan. We had strategic conversations with Asher Taylor and you, Sparky, about how Joe Biden should go about doing this in a way that would avoid a legal challenge. They obviously chose not to just cancel it day one in a way that could have avoided some of this. We talked at length. You, Persis, debated Judge Sugarman about strategically whether or not the HEROES Act, which was the act used to promote, to pursue Joe Biden's student debt cancellation plan, was as wise a choice as the Higher Education Act, and whether or not it was credible and what was going to go down in the Supreme Court. And now here we are. So I want to come to you first, Persis. What are your initial thoughts and feelings about the Supreme Court's decision?
Sigh. Look, I think it will surprise no one to know that I think the Supreme Court got it wrong here. I think that this decision is just a flagrant, violation of law and facts. Look, these cases should never have gotten here. And I think that's what we talked about last time, was that there's just no way that if you look at this set of facts, that you should get to the conclusion that they should even be at the Supreme Court right now. That said, unfortunately, with this court, facts don't seem to matter. And also, unfortunately, the way that the law is actually written also doesn't seem to matter to this court right now. And so I think this speaks to a broader problem with the courts more generally. And I wish I were surprised by the outcome of this decision. But I think at the end of the day, what we have to remember is that there are 40 million student loan borrowers who are counting on this relief. And so we need the president to deliver this in some other way.
All right, we're going to get into what Biden's so-called Plan B is in a bit. But let's just get right into the meat of this decision. Last time you were on the show, Persis, we talked about how challengers to Biden's student debt cancellation plan had a big standing hurdle. 6 states sued over this. Only the 8th Circuit said that there was a case here. And many of us thought that even if the court were ideologically opposed to student debt cancellation, they're going to have a hard time justifying why Mohela, which is this Missouri-based student debt processing company that did not choose to actually sue, was able to be kind of a stand-through plaintiff in this case, undermining some of the basic principles of procedural law here. So if we could just take one step back and explain why this standing issue was so contentious.
Right. So I think this is, again, where we're talking about made up facts, right? And I think it is really important to be very skeptical about the way that the court talks about Mohela here. But so going back to, October when this case was filed, Missouri is claiming that they can stand in the shoes for Mohela, and they're also claiming that Mohela was harmed. So I think both of those basic contentions are debatable and are wrong in my view. So, I mean, I think first of all, going to the question about is Mohela even harmed at all by student debt cancellation is, I think, a thing that people should be very skeptical of, right? Like, this is a loan company who is paid in order to get people out of debt. Like, that is essentially what a servicer is trying to do, is make it so that people get through their loan process. So the fact that they have a right to get rid of their debt sooner shouldn't really confer harm on them, but also like.
So to be clear, it's a company that was established by the government to process these student loans, and they earn a small fee on every loan serviced.
Yeah, I mean, so essentially, yeah. So Missouri set up this company, way back in the day in order to do the FFELP loans, the federal family education loans. But through the process of, time, they have become this major servicer for loans across the country, and they get paid, a monthly fee. It's a pretty small fee for each account that it services. And so, the other piece of it, and the debt collective has been really instrumental. So Sparky can probably speak to this better than I can, but they also get paid to process cancellation forms too. So I think there's a real genuine question about well, which is more, processing the cancellation forms or servicing these accounts. We don't know, but to the basic premise is they get paid some money to service some accounts. And what Missouri is saying is that they're going to lose those accounts and therefore they're going to lose money. And because they were set up by Missouri, which is true, Missouri, the state legislature set them up, but they set them up as an independent company. Missouri is not on the hook for Mohela's liabilities, and the revenue that Mohela gets doesn't flow to the state of Missouri. There's a couple of places where in the statute it says, oh, well, Mohela should pay Missouri some money for some stuff, except for that Mohela hasn't been making those payments anyway. So, right, it is a fiction upon a fiction that Mohela was harmed, therefore the state of Missouri is harmed, and therefore they have standing. And so I think that is really the fundamental flaw in this case. I mean, I think the flaws go further than that, but I think just on that piece of standing, that Missouri says that it gets to have standing and gets to challenge what is really an ideological challenge to debt cancellation because of some, very speculative and very fictional harm that it says that it's going to
okay. We're going to get into the ideological stuff, believe you me, but just to moot this a little bit. So Sparky, let me bring you in here. The SCOTUS opinion argues that there are these other cases. There's this Amtrak case and there's this Arkansas v. Texas case that cut the other way that support the court's argument here on standing. And with the Amtrak case, it's like Amtrak v. LeBron, I believe. And they say, well, there was some issue about whether or not Amtrak was going to be forced to or needed to or had to hang up some LeBron James, I guess, related advertising in its station. Does it constitute a government wing where normal free speech rules apply, or is it a private entity that can make its own decisions about what it can hang up or not hang up in its businesses? And the court decided that because Amtrak was set up by the government and was an arm of the government and run to benefit the people of the United States as opposed to personal profit motive, that it was an extension of the government and the rules applied. How is the kind of Team Biden side of this? How is the dissent distinguishing this case and the Texas case and making the argument that Mohela is a separate entity from Missouri, and if it wanted to bring this case, it should have brought it itself?
Yeah, so I'm not super deep in sort of this standing case law, but as far as I understand, that Amtrak case was about speech and was about First Amendment protections, right? As opposed to here, what we have is Mohela. I mean, Mohela's my loan servicer. It's probably a loan servicer for many of the people listening as well. Mohela is allowed, very explicitly to sue and be sued on his own behalf. Many people have sued Mohela. Missouri hasn't gotten involved in those lawsuits. And again, I think in the Amtrak case, and I think this is the case in the Texas case too, there was a dispute that involved, really directly involved the agency in question, where the state was stepping in on one side or the other. Here, Mohela didn't know what the hell Missouri was even up to, right? Persis and Student Bar Protection Center broke those emails that they got through a public records request, where Mohela employees are like sending emails back and forth, going, "What the hell's going on here? Like, are we the bad guys?" Is what they said. And so I think that, to me, that really kind of gives the game away, because this wasn't something where the state was really vindicating the interests of this entity to which it is closely involved and coordinating with and protecting itself and its own interests. Like, Mohela's out there doing whatever Mohela's going to do, which involves all kinds of weird stuff now that they were not doing when they were first set up. Student loan servicing in a bunch of different contexts, not just federal. And then Missouri's just going and doing Missouri's thing. And they're totally separate. They're not talking to each other. But again, the court just kind of glosses over those facts to say, well, but they're the same thing. And, I think that what's actually happening matters. And what's actually happening here was not some kind of big joint state enterprise. It was a company doing things and then a state AG who wanted to vindicate a political point.
I mean, the kind of unasked question here, or the unanswered question here, is if Mohela's interests are so overlapping with Missouri, and if Mohela is being damaged in this way that justifies it bringing suit and having standing, all this time having passed, why didn't Mohela just sue on its own behalf? And why did the court at any point acknowledge that hitch, that clear, that what the implication of them choosing not to do so really is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the question, right? And I think that part of the answer to that question, I mean, if you just think about it, right? Like, Mohela still has a contract with the Department of Education to service loans, which is it's not guaranteed that contract, right? And in fact, I mean, even if we kind of get to the structure of what gets to this in the beginning, which is that the Department of Education chose to structure its servicing contracts on this sort of per account serviced basis, and also per, cancellation processed basis, that, again, like Persis was saying, we don't actually know how those things play out or whether Mohela actually would be harmed. But like, that didn't have to happen either, right? Like, the Department of Education could have done a different contracting and payment structure that would have had a different result here. It's just kind of contingency all the way down.
Like, after the suit, between the filing of the suit and the judgment, could the Department of Education have made changes to its relationship with Mohela that would have basically undermined any claims of damages?
Well, I think it's actually kind of fascinating, if I can jump in fact, that the relationship between Mohela and the Department of Education did change through the process of this, and in fact, like, more favorably to Mohela, because at the moment when they filed the lawsuit, their contract was actually expiring. Like, they didn't even have a contract that extended out beyond, 2023. And so, I mean, which kind of just raises the absurdity of it. They have actually, since the lawsuit was filed, re-upped the contract and signed a new contract with the Department of Education, which is, an interesting choice, in my opinion, by the Department of Education.
Right. I mean, this is a political question.
Yeah.
And maybe an organizing question, many people are wondering about the true investment of the Biden administration in winning this, using all the tools at its disposal. And some might look at the choice to say, we're going to continue to have a longer term financial relationship with you that gives you the standing that is enabling this entire plan to be undermined in the courts, as evidence of the Biden administration's unwillingness to fully fight this the way that it's now claiming it has and will continue to do.
Yeah. Fair. I mean, look, like, my line on this, which I think is still right, is like, I don't think that the administration is sort of a coordinated whole enough to really be trying to appear to do something while also trying to sabotage itself at the same time, in a very intentional way. But I think that multiple administrations and the Department of Education has a long history of continuing to contract with student loan servicers, even while they sue them for lying to people. right? Like the CFPB sued Navient for lying to people about their federal student loans and then signed, I think, multiple more contracts with them while that suit was ongoing. It's kind of mind-boggling.
Well, but why, Sparky? Is it do they feel like, well, these loans have to get serviced and somebody's got to do it and there's no institutional actors who can take it on? Like, do they even give lip service to those kinds of notions? Or to what do you attribute that choice?
I don't know, right? Like, coming from me, it's speculation. My speculation is probably just that they're big institutions with a lot of pieces moving in parallel and not many people talking to each other. And yeah, everything you said, right? Like, oh, we got to service it. Like, who else are we going to go to? There's a lot of inertia. There are a bunch of relationships. I mean, like, all of that, you get down to it. It's like, it's bullshit. It shouldn't happen. It's ridiculous in this case, in that case, in every circumstance where this has happened. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous even to just go back and think, okay, well, we've essentially nationalized student lending, but we still privately contract out the servicing of the loans, which then gives rise to all of these ridiculous situations in the first place. So again, I mean, I tend not to see some evil genius at work here. I just see kind of, ridiculous incompetence, absurdity, inertia.
Okay, let it be incompetence. But here's my issue is that Miguel Cardona is the Secretary of Education. I almost never hear his name mentioned, even in the context of these kind of people who are very hands-on like you guys. Like, no one's ever saying, we heard Betsy DeVos the entire time Trump was in office. People knew who the Secretary of Education was. She was, reviled by liberal media. She was doing bad things with Title IX and the kids' bathrooms, and she was the worst, right? She was going to voucherize the whole public education system. We all knew who she was. She was enemy numero uno. And I'm not saying Miguel Cardona is Betsy DeVos, but here's someone who has agency in all of this and against whom pressure could be applied to do things like what you're describing. When we were talking last year about these lawsuits against student debt cancellation and anticipating this very moment, and it becomes clear at some point that this Missouri case has legs on it, and there's going to be the standing issue. I do have questions about why the follow-up isn't, okay, why are we not pressuring Miguel Cardona to disrupt the relationship that gives the case legs to begin with,
I mean, I think one of the pieces, I think what this brings up for me is also just how fundamentally broken the entire student loan system is, right? And so I think part of the conundrum that we're facing is that the administration would have to acknowledge how broken this entire endeavor that we're working with is. That, I think there's a real problem with them hiring Mohela, and I will not be the person to defend that choice. In saying that there is an entity who is like threatening the finances of 40 million borrowers, we should not hire them. I think that was a poor choice. But I think the bigger picture is that, like, this really is broken. And, like, is there somebody who could do this well? Probably not. Like, the thing is just so fundamentally flawed that I don't know that this is a thing that could be done well.
Well, but not done well, Persis, just
done without, like, financially harming millions of people. Yeah.
You simply say Mohela's not getting, there's going to be no renewed contract. We're prematurely ending our contract. I don't know what the, liability issues would be with doing that. But you're already saying to me that the contract didn't extend beyond 2023. And maybe the court would say, well, they still have standing because they have the losses for the remainder of 2023 or whatever. But at least, that's an argument. We're in the mix. And part of the issue here is, I hear your point about how broken the system is more broadly, which implicates a more structural critique of student debt than I would argue Joe Biden and his administration is willing to do. And I think that is part of the problem and why so many leftists have had mixed feelings and a lot of apprehension about Joe Biden even wading into these waters, because there was some skepticism that he was the man for the job. Because taking this piecemeal approach is exposing exactly these kinds of vulnerabilities. But if he's not willing to, talk about them, target them, exploit them, so that even his more moderate program has some chance of survival, then it was DOA. And, a lot of us were worried that it was going to be DOA because he ultimately wasn't going to have the fight for it. And it's in moments like this that I think validate that perspective to a certain degree. I mean, am I just being big mad on the internet right now?
Well, let me jump back to your previous point just for a second, because I think that at least with the debt collective, maybe we haven't done a good enough job, but we have been trying to name and actually point out what these leverage points are, right? And so if you look back, at least at the Twitter feed, right? Like we talk a lot about and to Cardona and to James Cabal and to various other people who are, Rich Cordray, people who actually work for the Department of Education, who are the decision makers in these circumstances to some extent. Although, again, you still kind of do have to target almost everything at the White House because nothing happens without the White House approving it. To your later point, I mean, I get that. Like, I feel that too. But then the question for me always comes down to like, okay, so what? Like, what should we do? Should we do nothing? Should we let all of these people suffer because we think that the White House right now is going to fuck this up? And so, we'll wait for 4 or 8 or 12 years until maybe we got something better. Should we all just should Persis and I find something else to focus on for the next decade?
Certainly not. This is the argument, I think, for a maximum, but for you guys, certainly, I wouldn't know any of this. You know what I mean? I wouldn't know any of the inflection points or the vulnerabilities that we should be pressing on, to your point, Sparky. So I'm enormously grateful for that. I'm thinking a little prospectively here from a, organizing perspective, because I am worried about what happens when the Plan B comes into effect and how many of these vulnerabilities will persist. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, and I've already taken us off on a frolicking detour. So we got through the standing bit, but the one last thing I want to ask about the standing issue, again, for non-lawyers, the whole gist is that the legal system says everyone can't just sue everyone, even if you're not interested, right? I can't say I see some injustice happening over there in Nebraska and say, well, I'm personally offended by it, so I'm going to sue, even though this thing had absolutely nothing to do with me. We got to put some guardrails on this whole legal system, and that's the guardrail that's been long established. This is a core fundamental principle. So some people I saw arguing that the expansive reading of standing here might have some far-reaching consequences. And I saw, I think, a tweet that joked that, someone who, some billionaire who one day plans to visit Antarctica is going to use this kind of broad reading of standing to, sue that they, say that they have some, are able to contest some, effort to in an oil drilling company or something like that. Like the idea, the classic law school case is the woman who had bought a ticket to go see a national park with wolves in it. Is that what Lujan was about? I forget now. But are there concerns about this being overly broad in a way that will have more implications beyond this case?
I mean, I am certainly concerned about this idea that, you just have this constitutional right to make money, and that, I mean, you still, right, like this is kind of like fundamentally what it was about, is that Mohela apparently had this right to make money. And if they don't make money, somehow they have the right to challenge public policy, right? Like we should not be making public policy based on what's making servicers money. We should be making public policy based on what's best for, borrowers and taxpayers. And here, that was not the question. And so we have servicers who can, veto the president's agenda, which seems like a huge problem. And then this other weird kind of Mohela owes Missouri money, and therefore Missouri can, sue people that Mohela would get money from. That's pretty bizarre. But I think, I think the bigger question for me is this question about people's right to make money and at the cost of public policy.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that any corporation that is negatively impacted financially by a regulation is now set up to challenge the regulation does basically, build a road to dismantling any kind of regulatory agenda whatsoever.
Right. I mean, and we saw this with SoFi, chose to sue the administration over the payment pause too, because they were losing money. well, your business model just wasn't good enough to compete. But that doesn't mean that we need to hold student loan borrowers hostage to your business interests. And I think that's the thing that really concerns me.
Yeah, we're going to outlaw child labor, and now all of those meatpacking plants in the Midwest are going to get mad and sue. They can't exploit children for low wages anymore.
I mean, but the point that we all also already discussed a little bit, kind of the non-decision point, the non-precedential point in terms of this case getting to the Supreme Court on this totally wild speculative claim that may or may not be true, that no one even made directly for a long time, right? Like that is also, I think, an example, it's like, yeah, we can talk about what this means for the standing doctrine, but kind of doesn't really matter because the Supreme Court's just going to pull up whatever case they want to pull up and do whatever they want with it regardless.
Yeah.
Let's get into the meat and potatoes of that, because once we get past standing, which we shouldn't have, but here we are, now we're in this kind of direct reading of the HEROES Act. And what you argue so persuasively last time you were on the show, Persis, is that yes, the Higher Education Act would be better, but the HEROES Act is actually very clear, and we should be winning on the HEROES Act too. So this came down to this discussion of the phrase waive or modify. That the HEROES Act grants the Secretary of Education the ability to waive or modify in order to accommodate basically any emergency. In this case, COVID was the emergency hook. It's the same authority that the loans were initially paused under, and many student debt advocates argue that this is the same authority that should be used to cancel student debt. 6 Supreme Court justices felt otherwise. They argued that the words waive or modify did not mean a waiver of student debt payments, that modify did not mean to modify existing kinds of cancellations that included lowering debt amounts for teachers, student debt, income-based forgiveness, and those kinds of things. And that what Biden's plan was effectively rewriting the statute. What do you make of this argument?
I mean, I think there was a lot of like hand waving and gesticulation about how big this is, right? Mm-hmm. And I think who knew we would all spend so much time on the 2 words waive and modify in 2023. But I think, they spend a lot of time talking about how unprecedented this is. But I think, Justice Kagan retorts really well. The moment was unprecedented. If you were to match an unprecedented disaster, how could you do so with something that is precedented, right? Like, there's somewhat a circular nature of these, of what they're talking about. And I think they just kind of do a lot of hand waving about how big this is. And because it's big, it can't possibly fit into those words that we've talked about. And I think there's a reason why we gave the secretary discretion to do, what the secretary deemed as necessary to ensure that, borrowers do not reach financial harm. And that's because the secretary is in the best position to understand what meets the moment, right? Congress could not predict every single emergency. And that is why Congress gave the secretary broad, expansive authority. And so, the fact that it's never been done before, which I think is kind of how they land on the place where this isn't a waiver or modification, is kind of incoherent with what the purpose of the HEROES Act was to begin with.
Yeah, what did you think of it, Sparky? I agree with Persis that there did seem to be a preoccupation with the scale and scope of the thing, which is a separate thing from the quality of the thing described and whether or not the act contemplates the quality of the relief given. Because it does seem to me that the examples that were raised by the majority as counterexamples to what Biden is doing here, or what Secretary Cardona is doing here, ostensibly as the secretary in the act, it's the same thing. It's the HEROES Act. Okay, 9/11 happens. You want service members not to have to pay back their loans. They're doing things.
Right.
Okay, right. A COVID happens. People aren't working. You want them not to have to pay back their loans. It's substantively identical. But what they're freaking out about is, but 44 million people, 43 million people are implicated. And
Right.
some people have all of their loans canceled. So it's not a waiver because it's absolute. And so therefore it must be something different.
Right. Where they're like, well, previously we had a disaster that affected a smaller number of people. And so the action was smaller. And therefore the action has never been this big.
Right. Right.
Yeah, no, and you'll notice that, that whole discussion, all of the hand waving about how big this is in kind of absolute dollar terms and absolute number of people terms, rather than being about, the humongous total of the student debt that's out there.
Yes.
And, it never really, again, it's like it's just trying to create vibes, right? Vibes of unprecedentedness, even though they don't actually make sense logically and maybe aren't even true in this circumstance, where, as I'm sure many of your listeners will agree, this is certainly the case for me. Like, I was going to get $20,000 off of a balance that was not going to significantly change anything about my life because I will still have a large student loan balance. So again, it's like, yes, big emergency justifies big action. Congress said the Secretary of Education could take action at their discretion according to the emergency. And I think the court just does this really kind of surface level, insufficient gloss on what even the Higher Education Act says, right? They're just kind of like, here are some circumstances where Congress gives them permission to cancel loans. And so, this isn't really waiving or modifying that. I was like, well, the Higher Education Act says a bunch more than that, right? Like, it's actually, the court did not do, in some ways, maybe it's good for us, the court didn't do too deep a dive into the Higher Education Act because they might have said some other bad stuff, but it was not really a good faith reading of what exactly was happening here, of what the Department of Education has done in the past in other circumstances with other parts of the Higher Education Act. It was just really just hand waving and big numbers.
So do you mean the Higher Education Act here, or do you mean the HEROES Act? No.
I mean the Higher Education Act, when the court was talking about what provisions would be waived or modified.
I see. Okay. So one part of this decision that got a lot of airplay was where it said the Secretary's plan has modified the cited provisions only in the same sense that the French Revolution modified the status of French nobility. It has abolished them and supplanted them with a new regime entirely. And now this blew my mind for exactly the reasons that you just articulated, Sparky, is that there was this focus. I just was tweeting about this actually. There's this focus on the 43 million total number, and the number that it's going to eliminate all of these loans and all of this money. It's going to be canceled. But if the comparison here is, well, Biden is abolishing student debt. Golly gee, I wish, but that is certainly not the case. What we're talking about is maybe 43 million, but only about, I think I read that 20 million would still have student debt even after Biden's $10,000 to $20,000 cancellation.
Yeah.
All right. And that is like quite literally for many of us a modification. If you're going from $90,000 down to $10,000, down to $80,000, or $40,000 down to $20,000 of debt, or whatever it is, and that the court at no point is forced to reckon with the literal modification that is at stake for at least approximately half of the people touched by this policy, is either negligent, idiotic, or evil.
Well, certainly ideological. I think there's another piece, where Roberts goes into how the HEROES Act allows these waivers and modifications only where necessary, is what he says, where the HEROES Act does not have the word only in it. That is a word he just completely made up and threw in there, and which completely changes the meaning of the sentence that word shows up in. And you can see, like, if you just read the sentence, it's like, quote, unquote, only, quotes again, he literally just inserted a word that changed the entire meaning of the statute. And I think what's notably missing from this entire analysis, there's a lot about this is really big, this is really costly, this is a lot of people, is what is the harm of not doing this, right? Like that's the magnitude that is 100% missing here, is what is the cost if we don't do this? What is the cost to the student loan borrowers who are counting on this because they're going to, fall behind on their loans and go into default? What is the cost to their families? What is the cost to our communities, to our economy at large, if we don't do this thing that the economic data shows is necessary to prevent financial catastrophe? I think that's the piece that is, I was expecting to be really frustrated by the decision and the discussion of student loan borrowers. And what I found to be astonishing was that there was none. It was completely missing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's important morally, but that's also, I think, a big hole in terms of just the legalistic analysis, right? If what you're trying to figure out is what did Congress intend these words to mean, it's not just in a vacuum. It's in the sort of circumstance that we find ourselves now, right? Which is to say, when Congress enacted the HEROES Act, it's not just, did waive or modify mean something big? It's did waive or modify mean something big depending on the context of the emergency, which kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier. But you would think it would be relevant to know, okay, what happens if the secretary does not do this? Is that the kind of outcome that Congress might have intended in passing the HEROES Act, right? But that just does not appear at all.
Yeah, I mean, another, head desk moment that people were pointing to. I think Ellie Mistel, he's gives commentary on MSNBC. He, I believe, was the editor at Above the Law. I don't know if he still is there, but he gives a lot of legal commentary. And he wrote a piece in The Nation comparing how Roberts ruled in Trump v. Hawaii versus in this case. And this was something that I think Judge Sugarman brought up, having some concern about whether or not this would basically create a precedent that would allow Trump to, and someone in that situation, to have the Muslim ban that would validate and justify the Muslim ban. But Ellie Mistel points out that whereas in the Muslim ban case, Donald Trump declared a fake national emergency over immigration and then proclaimed the way to address it was to use a religious test to determine entry into the country, i.e. no Muslims. In that case, Robert ruled that Trump did not exceed his executive or statutory authority. Roberts wrote, quote, Congress's decision to authorize the benefit for many of America's closest allies did not implicitly foreclose the executive from imposing tighter restrictions on the nationals of certain high-risk countries. So in that case, he says, even if the statute doesn't explicitly say the president has the authority to do a Muslim ban, he has the authority to do the Muslim ban. In this case, it was the exact opposite, saying the secretary says he wants to do this. Here's statutory authority that he's relying on. But if the statutory authority doesn't literally say something along the lines of, hey, if there's a pandemic, you can cancel all student debt, that we cannot read that in. I mean, do you agree with that analysis that there's this real 180 reversal from Roberts here on this particular issue?
Yeah. What are you saying?
I mean, how bad is this?
I mean, are you saying that they decide the cases that they want to decide, right? I mean, I think this is the problem. Like this always comes back to the same place, right? Like, I think, we asked for more from the president, and I have a number of critiques about how this was done, but I think at the end of the day, I think it was a legal program that he implemented. And the real fundamental problem that we have here is that we have these broken courts that are just not going to side with the president, right? We did have cases thrown out on standing. So apparently standing sometimes matters, right?
Yeah.
Right. But I think that's where we're getting back to the fundamental place, is that this court is going to rule on ideological lines. And unfortunately, I think we all knew that. And I think that the problem is it speaks more to the courts than it does to whatever it is we're talking about, right? This wasn't about student loan borrowers. It was about this ideological fight.
What do you make of the citation in the majority of then Speaker Nancy Pelosi's argument that the president does not have the power to cancel student debt.
What is there to say about this?
I know,
Persis,
I
do you have
mean-
anything to say? But I just like, it's so infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it was an unfortunate comment that the speaker made. The speaker's not a party in this case. Lots of people have said that, but that doesn't make it right. I think that at the end of the day, that the comment is really irrelevant legally. And, people have different opinions about what the president can do. But the fact that she said that really has no legal relevance and is mostly just meant to be a dig to say like, hey, it's not just us, there's other people too.
And other liberals and senior members of Biden's own administration is the argument. Right.
Well, yeah, she's not a member of the, I agree with everything Persis said, and also would just add with friends like these, right?
Yeah. So not of the administration, but of the Democratic Party,
right.
Third in command or whatever she is, or was at the time. Okay. I'm contemplating how much I want to get more into the case before we move on. I think it's time we should just move on to the Plan B stuff. All right. So Biden has announced that he's not going down fighting. That one, there is a plan to have an on-ramp that will make starting payments on October 1st easier. And two, that he's going to do what many of us, including you two, have been advocating all along, which is that using the Higher Education Act would be better than the HEROES Act, and he's going to take a second bite at the apple. I want to start with that second part first. When I believe Judge Sugarman was on the program, there was some argument about whether or not the Higher Education Act was going to take too much time and whether or not there was going to be enough time left in the Biden administration to go that route. Where are we standing on that now? What is that looking like now?
I mean, I'm very concerned about time. I will say that. I think, okay, there's this on-ramp, but interest is still going to accrue during this on-ramp period. So it is not as harsh as borrowers immediately going into default, but there are consequences for borrowers not making payments. And so I'm very concerned about the ability to deliver this relief in a timely way. I think I agree with the basic premise of what the president is doing here. I think it is laudable that he is trying to implement this program again through the Higher Education Act. I think that that's a valid use and that's what he should have been doing. I think that there are probably faster ways of doing this than going through a negotiated rulemaking. And so I think time is still the problem here. I think time was the problem a year ago and time is the problem now. I think fundamentally, no. Yeah.
The reason it takes longer is that there's a notice and comment period with the Higher Education Act that didn't exist with the HEROES Act because the HEROES Act is like an emergency act. Is that the idea?
Right. So the HEROES Act explicitly waived the notice and comment. What the Department of Education wants to do is not just a notice and comment, but what they are intending to do is to say that they're going to go through this negotiated rulemaking process, which is a process of convening a committee that has to meet over several months that will then produce a draft regulation that will go into notice and comment. And so that is a very lengthy and protracted process. And so we are, of course, concerned that it won't be able to deliver the relief to the borrowers before payments turn back on.
Oh, so the goal is to the time limitedness is about payments coming back on. I thought it was about not being able to happen before the end of the Biden administration.
I mean, my concern is primarily about payments turning back on, but I think there is also a concern about being able to finish it before the end of the administration.
Because those are two very different timelines, right? Because payments turn back on October 1st.
Yeah, that's
soon.
soon.
That's a much harsher deadline than, by the end of 2024 is bad enough. Or beginning of 2025 feels like a very weird number in my mouth. 2025. What is even that? Ugh.
Yeah, but yes, payments coming back on is soon, but also just bear in mind what it means for payments to come back on, which is you've got 20 million people who were promised that their entire debt was being canceled, who are now going to be asked to make payments in October. And sure, we've got this on-ramp thing where the administration is like, we're not going to do the really harsh, extremely, terrible things that we normally do to you to collect the loans for a year. But interest is still going to accrue, right? And I haven't seen it. I don't know if you've thought about this, Persis, but I don't know, what if the negotiated rulemaking takes a year and then your interest has put you over the amount that's being canceled, right? There are all these other complications. It's yeah, that is a very fast turnaround. Yeah, that's kind of a crazy demand to make, I guess, to some extent, maybe to deal with it before then. But also, this is going to have real world effects for 20 million people plus, I
think just think about the 16 million borrowers who have received notices that said you were approved for this debt relief, right? So we go through this big, long process. They've been in repayment now. They've had interest accumulating for, let's say a year, just to pick a time frame to talk about, right? A year's worth of interest accumulating on debt that has already been promised to be forgiven, right? So they're going to not just owe more money, because of time, but because the debt that was supposed to be gone isn't going to be gone yet. And so, I think that there is a real harm in waiting for this lengthy time. Not just yes, are they going to be able to complete the job? We saw, in the Obama administration with, the borrowers who went to the Corinthian schools, they weren't able to finish that job. And that was really tragic. So I do think that's a real legitimate concern, and we've seen it historically. But I do think even in the case where those borrowers do eventually get the cancellation, there's still going to be harm because they're still going to owe more money at the end of the day.
So this is a big deal. And it strikes me that we are in this situation. The best thing, I won't say, this is very subjective, but one of the best things that came out of this whole process was not just the prospect of cancellation, but getting multiple years of no interest accrual.
Yeah.
Especially for people with really big balances, which I understand is not the majority. And I don't mean to overly focus conversation on that group that I have to be a part of. But, $10,000 is, a year of interest. It's nice to have it forgiven, but much more impactful is not having to pay interest for 3 years and being able to save to pay off the principal. Right. So knowing that, how are you guys reflecting over the Biden administration's choice to bargain away the moratorium and the debt ceiling fight? The only thing that the Democrats were apparently willing to give up, basically, was ending the moratorium, which has now these really dramatic effects as we see the student debt plan, but predictably, getting overturned by the Supreme Court.
Yes, bad luck.
Yeah, to say, that was an infuriating choice that the president bargained away this really important tool that he's had, in order to address what I do think, was a fairly predictable result.
You just, you do not, it's not good to see, particularly in this context, particularly with the politics given what they are right now, a tremendously helpful benefit begun by the Trump administration being taken away by the Biden administration.
Yes.
It's not a good look. I would not have done that.
If illegal, do you know if legally speaking, what is binding? I don't mean to be, but student debt being so in the control of the federal government. These are federally held loans. This is a Department of Education fiat. That's how it got done in the first place by Betsy DeVos. I understand that this was negotiated in the debt ceiling fight, but is there anything precluding Joe Biden from reneging, from implementing a new pause? Or are we really going to look to a world where a bunch of people start having their interest payments accrue while all of this fight is still ostensibly pending as he tries to run it through using the Higher Education Act this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, is there any possible way? I think that there might be possible ways of extending it. I think, realistically, we have the president that we have. And I think a more realistic pathway at this point is trying to figure out how to cancel these debts faster.
And I appreciate your position on that, Persis, but I think what is relevant to some people as they're trying to assess how good faith Biden is. I think you're right. Realistically, I don't think, because I don't think he is especially good faith, that he would be inclined to fight in whatever way might be potentially possible to extend the debt moratorium. However, knowing if he could is important if you're making an assessment about whether or not he's behaving in the best faith or if he's really a fighter in this moment. If he can't do it, then it's fine and it's not his fault. And this is not another reason to be upset with him, right? So that's why I'm curious, even if we think it's unlikely that he would do it, are there things that he could be doing to try to actually extend the moratorium in light of the Supreme Court judgment?
So Persis has the better and more nuanced legal reasoning here. I think that for my part, all that I keep coming back to is like, the Supreme Court is not going to hit the collect button, right? Like, Congress is not hitting the button to add interest to the loans or to, say go to the servicers or to garnish people's wages or benefits or whatever that is, right? There's still a bunch of people within the administration, within the Department of Education, that have to take a bunch of actions to make these things happen. And they have not been ordered by the Supreme Court or even necessarily by Congress in order to do that. So, again, I think I would defer to Persis on the questions of like, what are the legal authorities at play there? But I just point out, like, in the real world, there's a bunch of stuff that has to happen and a bunch of people that have to do those things. And I hope some of them don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are definitely options on the table. And so I don't think we have to give up entirely on, I do think that, like, Biden has, for whatever reason, locked himself into the moratorium as it appears today cannot be the thing that exists on September 1st. I do think that there are other options on the table. And I mean, they're using some of them to some degree with this on-ramp program. I think that they could be more aggressive about that. And I think it's certainly, I think there's good reason to think that, for the folks who have been approved for the debt cancellation program, as they're relitigating, that there were good reasons why at least some subsets of borrowers should have everything paused. But I do think that there are more options on the table and that they could be more aggressive, both in terms of cancellation, but also in terms of what they do in the meantime as they're working this out.
Maybe this is a good time to play a clip. Ayanna Pressley was asked recently on MSNBC if Biden's latest repayment plan is aggressive enough. This is from a July 2nd interview. I want you to listen to her response and then tell me what you might recommend differently.
Congresswoman, the White House saying they're going to lower the repayment threshold to 5% and then find a path to relief for student loan borrowers. In your opinion, is this an aggressive enough plan?
Again, I want borrowers to know that you are powerful and President Biden heard you. The fact that they came out quickly to say that they are not done fighting for borrowers. And so I'm encouraged that they are prepared to be nimble. And I will at this point be focused on oversight and implementation to ensure that whatever we do is something where this meaningful, life-changing, transformative relief is felt swiftly. After Biden's initial executive action, there were some out of eligible borrowers, 26 million people already signed up for this out of eligible borrowers. And I think 16 million were already approved. And so people's lives are in limbo. And Katie, when you layer this with the fact that in August, payments are set to resume with interest. Again, this is deeply consequential. There's a psychological toll, there's an economic burden, and we all suffer for it. I represent a healthcare mecca, and when I've talked to presidents and CEOs of those hospitals and healthcare centers about what can we do to replenish this bench, since so many healthcare workers have left because of fatigue and burnout post-pandemic. And they said the number one thing that you can do is cancel student debt. So, of course, this is about the burden on borrowers, but there's a greater implication writ large. And this Supreme Court must be reformed and expanded. They continue to overturn the will of the majority of the people and to make history for all the wrong reasons, legislating from the bench and being political from the bench. They have been enlisted as co-conspirators from the state legislature to the lower courts all the way to the Supreme Court to advance this extremist far-right agenda. It is nothing but intersectional oppression.
Did you hear an answer about whether or not Biden's plan is aggressive enough? And do you think Biden's plan is aggressive enough?
I mean, I'm not sure I heard that answer. She said a bunch of things that were definitely true.
It's true. She did the I see you, I hear you, here are some true things that exist in the world that I will state for you in a row.
Look, I mean, if the question, and I think you started with sort of the new repayment plan, and like, is that aggressive enough? No, it's not aggressive enough in my opinion, because student debt is unjust. And so anything short of canceling it all or finding some way to do something that effectively cancels it all is not aggressive enough. I mean, I think this was originally Persis's idea, right? But like the plan should be one payment, and then and then your debt is canceled, right? That could be your new.
Wait, unpack that for me, Persis. What is this? What is?
Sorry,
this
am I calling you out on an old memo here?
No, it's a public. I was actually, I think when I wrote it in 2020, looking at ways that we could reform the income-based repayment. But the way that the statute is written, the only thing that it requires is that, there's a maximum of period of time. And that's why we've seen the various different, I don't know, what are we on, sixth iteration of an income repayment plan, but it sets a maximum repayment period. And all that it really requires is that at some point you enrolled in the program, and at some point you made a payment under this program. And then at some amount of time that is less than 25 years, the secretary can cancel it. So that is that's a proposal that I spoke more to the flexibility of how much latitude the secretary really does have with these payments. And so, I think Sparky is right. The system is broken and will never be fixed with a repayment plan.
So what you're saying is that Secretary Cardona could say that under an existing income-based repayment plan, to just do Joe Biden's plan, we say we set the income level at $125,000, and if you make one payment on your loans and you earn under $125,000 or did back in 2020, if that was the standard, then your loans get canceled after that one payment.
I think there's authority to do that. Yeah. I think there's lots of flexibility under the Higher Education Act.
I don't think that would be aggressive enough, but yeah.
Well, most certainly. But and that could be done immediately, or do we still have to go through the notice and comment period and all of that?
You have to do some kind of rulemaking to do it.
So we're still in the same zone of the timing issue.
Right. I think that there are different pathways that we can get here. And there are some ways in which I do think we would need to do some kind of rulemaking. I think, we've back in the beginning, when everyone started talking about cancellation, we talked about settlement and compromise and the fact that he can cancel debt with just the stroke of a pen. And I think it really is that simple, that we can just go back to the same principles that we started this whole movement with.
Look at that, because a bunch of individuals who I have come to find somewhat frustrating on the internet, who frame themselves as progressives, were making a lot of noise after the decision came down about how all of the leftists or student debt advocates or whatever were wrong about the stroke of the pen thing, that the Supreme Court judgment vindicates that the stroke of the pen thing was never true, and that Biden was doing the best he can. So what do you say to those people who should go unnamed?
Well, look, I think I disagree with said unnamed people. In that I think this decision was actually pretty narrow at the end of the day. There's a lot of dicta that goes on in this decision, but at the end of the day, it is a very narrow decision about what the president can do under the HEROES Act, and it was very much limited to the HEROES Act. And so I don't think it really did speak to what the president can do under these other authorities.
Remind me how settlement and compromise works for those who, like when we say he can do it with the stroke of a pen, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually a couple of different places in the statute, and I think there has become the settlement and compromise, words that have permeated kind of our language. But there's under the statute, the secretary has the broad latitude to modify loans, to compromise loans, to waive various different provisions of both of the promissory note of the contract, but also of the payments. This is, on the one-off basis, what we get is, when you see like borrowers who settle loans, this is the authority that they use. We see this when with some of the fraudulent schools where borrowers have taken on massive amounts of debt, where they have then, canceled them out. Those were done under executive orders.
So all of the stuff, they reference all of that in the opinion. So basically what you're saying is, those were offered in the opinion in the majority as justification, as counterexamples to what Biden is advocating for now. But what you're saying is you can go back in and say, okay, you thought it was cool beans when all of these other kinds of modifications were made under executive authority. And you think that all of those were genuine modifications / waivers because you offered them up in your own opinion as counterexamples. And now we're going to go back in and say, okay, well, we're going to do exactly that. You said, okay, you thought that student debt, income-based repayment counted. Okay, we're going to do an income-based repayment. We're just going to make the amount really tiny and the duration of the payments really small. You're welcome. This is what you wanted, right, Robert? That's what we're talking about at this point.
I mean, I think there's a number of different ways that they can slice this apple. But yeah, I think that they can do a number of different orders in various different ways in order to get relief much faster.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not quite on board with the sort of reading of the opinion, because I think that, like Persis was saying before, right, the opinion is about waive or modify under the HEROES Act, which requires the emergency as the starting point, and they're talking about the way, and then, of course, there are statutory provisions in the Higher Education Act for some specific circumstances when cancellation can happen. The court names some of those. I think what Persis is saying is that there are also just a bunch of other circumstances in which cancellation happens under other provisions of the Higher Education Act that sometimes kind of touch on those statutory categories as well, but are not necessarily coexistent, that the court just totally ignores the fact that actually the Secretary of Education cancels a bunch more debt in a bunch of other ways under the Higher Education Act already, which isn't to say that we would then go back and say, oh, so we're doing this again under the HEROES Act and pointing out all these other things, but just that there's myriad paths to debt cancellation that are already in existence, that are already used under the Higher Education Act. And importantly, and I think this was kind of touched on a bit in a Politico article a few days ago, some of which might be rules and require notice and comment, and some of which might be able to be done with orders that do not require notice and comment.
I might just say I'm ordering the education department not to collect any federal debt. Like I'm just don't do it. The same way that it can, prosecutors can have discretion to not go after marijuana cases to your point earlier, Persis, about, I think it was you that were saying there's certain things that have to happen and the Supreme Court hasn't ordered anybody to do X, Y, and Z. I mean, technically, what is the mechanism that starts the debt collections going again? And what is precluding the Biden administration from simply, since it's its own government's debt, right? That's the whole gist here. It's the federal government's own choice whether or not to demand repayment on the loans that it issued. What is stopping Joe Biden from just saying, well, I refuse to take your money?
So I do think it's a little bit more complicated than that. There is a duty under this both horrible in name and horrible in content statute, the Debt Collection Improvement Act. And so like there are some duties. I think it's not quite as broad, but I think that there is a lot of latitude that the secretary has on the how and the when and in terms of the collection. And so I think that there are ways that they can do more.
This is not like a well thought out point or anything. I'm just kind of wondering, like, who has standing to sue? Servicers getting paid their servicing amount. Yeah, I would be interested to know, even if that maybe was contra the Debt Collection Improvement Act, if there's anyone who could challenge that. Although, again, as we've seen, the court is willing to entertain any bullshit that comes across its desk.
Do you expect any lawsuits from the 16 million people who had a reliance interest on not having to pay these debts back, or not having to pay at least $10,000 of their debt back?
I mean, I think that is a really important group of people that we should be looking at and seeing what they do, because I think that there is a question about the legal enforceability of that debt right now. And frankly, that is one of the grounds in which the administration can use to cancel loans, whether if there's a question about the legal enforceability of a debt. And I do think the fact that, these folks received an email that says you have been approved for this debt, for this debt cancellation program, raises a really interesting question about whether or not it really is enforceable. And certainly if you're going to say like there's 16 million people, will somebody sue? I mean,
yeah,
that doesn't require necessarily legal analysis. That's more about, what do you think people will do? And lots of people use the courts.
Yeah. I mean, I expect so. I hope so. I'm very interested to see how that goes. I also just want to, emphasize again, this has been the theme this whole time, but like the courts are not our friends. The courts are not going to save us here, right? All of this is about, what leverage can we exert and what are people going to do? People with power in various positions and people with power as an organized mass, right? What is everyone going to do here? What are the effects going to be? And so we can talk about these legal points and we can talk about the authority and the notice and comment and what's required when. And we can talk about, okay, who's going to file what lawsuit and are they going to have standing? But ultimately, this question is, it's a question of leverage and incentives. And, to get to the heart of it, it is a quintessentially political question. This is a political calculation the administration is and ought to be making, and a political and our main leverage here is in fact political leverage.
Well, to that end, Sparky, I want to know from your perspective and the debt collective's perspective, what's next? This will be my last question. I tried to hop on the call that the debt collective had after the decision came down. It very quickly filled up. And I think that is indicative of the level of interest people have in understanding what their political options are moving forward. I saw some tweets from either Astra or the Debt Collective account that were kind of hinting around the idea of non-payment and a debt strike. What was said on the call that I missed, and what are next steps?
Yeah, so I mean, the call was an interesting time because it was between the decision and the quote unquote plan B that came from the administration, right? So a lot of what we talked about is just what would have been good enough, which was not what the administration announced.
Well, what would have been good enough?
Something immediate and universal that didn't give anyone a chance to challenge it. Same as in the first place. But I think, in terms of what the next steps are, and just to say for folks who don't know, right, the Debt Collective is a union of debtors. We're not, we're not like a legal advocacy organization or something. So to a large extent, we are figuring this out along the way with our members on these calls that sometimes get too big. But I think that some of the stuff that is in the works right now is we've got, again, realizing that our leverage here is primarily political. We've got some tools that folks can use to help send petitions / letters on various points that we think are important points of leverage. We've got a survey form set up that I can send you a link to that actually asks people, how has your life changed, or what did you do when you thought you were getting $10,000 or $20,000 of your debt canceled, that now this has, means that the fact that you're not is going to make your life worse. And then I can't say exactly what the next one of those tools is going to be, but we're going to have another one that I think is drawing on some of these concepts that Persis is talking about. Again, to try to build some leverage, some kind of combination political and legal leverage here. And then still, and this has been the case for a long time, we are building toward a payment strike for when payments resume. And just to say, right, like the debt collective notion of a debt strike for federal student loans is not to go into default. We're not hurting the government. We're not exercising leverage by depriving the government of our payments, because the government does not need our payments. If anyone had any doubt of that, the last 3 years, I think, could completely remove any doubt. Obviously, the government doesn't need our payments. We don't get leverage that way. We get leverage by politicizing our position as student debtors and making clear that this is not a private matter that we're not going to talk about, and we're not going to enter the political sphere. So the student debt strike, we have a page that, again, I'll send you the link for, that spells out the different ways that you can safely get to your payment to zero. It's about getting the payment to zero. Does not have to be a default.
Some people are looking at how the last 6-10 months or whatever played out, and they see Joe Biden announcing this plan shortly before midterms. We see a spike in youth turnout that is also, I think, attributable to the Dobbs decision. But you immediately see the court challenge, and it felt like a cynical inducement to get voters to turn out. For people who feel that way, if we're talking about political leverage, the obvious thing is to say, okay, I hear your point about not needing to strike to withhold money in a traditional kind of like labor withholding, like we're going to do damage to the company by withholding something from them because the government doesn't need the payment. But if that's the case, then it does seem to me, and I know this is a very touchy subject, I know what the implications are for any number of other substantive rights that people are having challenged right now. I would note having challenged under a Democratic administration, but never mind, that the thing to withhold is your vote, not necessarily, or in addition to potentially, your loan payment. And I do wonder if there is a conversation being had about whether or not, instead of these kind of blind endorsements, maybe arguably premature endorsements of Joe Biden that we've gotten from people like Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal and these progressive leaders, there should be a conversation about whether or not the votes of student debtors and the people who love student debtors should be contingent on Joe Biden demonstrating the level of fight that it seems that both of you two, that he has not yet demonstrated in terms of what he has the capacity to do as the chief executive. Yeah, I mean, again, from the perspective of the debt collective, I don't think we can take a position on that because we're a 501c3. I would say that to the extent you agree that the leverage at play here is largely political leverage, that seems to me like an exercise of political leverage that could be effective.
So similarly, here in my capacity as a 501c3. But one of the things that I do think is very fascinating, is we've been engaging in polling and looking at, we polled both, the president's debt relief plan, and we polled, the possibility of Plan B, and it's popular. And it's not just popular amongst Democrats. It is popular amongst independents. It is popular amongst young Republicans, right? So I think, there's both thinking about up and down the ticket, like people need to be making choices here. And I think that it is a very popular program. And I think it's because people understand the stakes for student loan borrowers, and they understand that the stakes are bigger than just for student loan borrowers. And I think, I do think that this case, of course, comes in a broader context of, the other cases that we saw this week and this year. And, that this is a concerted effort by the right to, to keep Black and brown, kids out of school, and those who dared to try to get an education, stuck in debt. And so I do think that there is very, very interesting information that folks should be looking on this issue.
Look, I really appreciate both of you spending so much time with me here today. I've kept you well over an hour. I am not kidding when I call you guys the A-team, and I'm so grateful for all of the time you spent educating me and the audience here about what our options really are and what our arguments should be, and also for pressing for this stuff out in the real world. Sparky with the Debt Collective, the organization as a whole, you, Astra, and everyone have been so important to this fight. So thank you both. And do let me know where, and let the audience know where they can find more from you and help support these efforts going forward. I'll start with you, Persis. Where do you exist online and elsewhere?
So at protectborrowers.org is where we have all of our advocacy. And you'll find, for example, that polling memo. And then we also run cancelmystudentdebt.org, which is a website which will gives folks resources into, it would have given you resources about the president's plan, but we also talk about all the other ways that borrowers can try to get out of debt.
And Sparky?
Yep. So for the Debt Collective, debtcollective.org, scroll down a bit. We've got a calendar of upcoming events and calls on there, which are always a really good time and usually don't fill up to the extent that people can't get in. That was a unique circumstance. And then, I'm also just an attorney in California. And so if you're in California, you have questions about your student debt or other stuff, my website is jubilee.legal.
All right. Thank you both. Thank you to the audience for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, you want to support independent media, feel free to subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for an additional Monday episode every single week, complete with video, and obviously the option to just listen. Thanks for your continued support. Take care of yourselves. And even if it's tough, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.